Hello everyone, welcome to my Dead Space remake, hard difficulty, no damage walkthrough. This is chapter 12, Dead Space, and while I do appreciate that this chapter is handled a lot better in terms of its pacing and the length of the enemy encounters, I still feel like this chapter is pretty dull and repetitive, and it's just something that persists throughout the entirety of this chapter. But the only thing that redeems the quality of this chapter is the final boss fight, because the final boss fight is absolutely phenomenal. It is a boss fight that works within the systems of the game. The developers don't do anything stupid with that boss. He doesn't have any shitty hitboxes. His moves actually feel like they complement the game's movement and the way you respond to the attacks. And the enemies that you deal with in that boss fight, you're not dealing with bullshit enemies like the armored necromorph or the lurkers. You're dealing with enemies that actually respond to the flamethrower and like your other weapons as well. Like you're dealing with the better bunch of enemy types. And that's what redeems this chapter, but I'll explain more about this when I get to that final boss fight. But this part right here, I take the blade from that previous necromorph, and I use it to stun that lurker, and then finish him off with 3 plasma cutter shots. And then I try to finish off the other necromorphs as fast as possible. And I don't exactly know how this fight works. I know this fight's in phases, but I'm not sure if the next phase of the encounter begins when you kill all the enemies, or if there's a time limit before the next phase begins, and so you gotta finish off the enemies in the first phase before these guys spawn. But all I'll say is that this is a very messy encounter. This is one of my least favorite combat encounters in the game, and I don't feel like the enemy diversity is restrained enough to prevent the player from actually coming across all sorts of issues. And the lurkers on this part, because you're dealing with the black lurkers, you're not going to be able to kill them instantly with the pulse rifle mines, and without the ability to kill lurkers instantly, they just become an absolute nuisance to deal with. And then when you have the enemies spawning all around you, you're forced to rely upon a lot of high-tiered weapons that have high amounts of damage if you're going to stand a chance against these enemies. And that's why I was mainly using my pulse rifle mines, and you don't see me use the pulse rifle mines at that great of a frequency in a single encounter, but for this one, I had to do something about it. And again, if I picked up the force gun from chapter 6, I would have had a much better time with this sequence, but in terms of how long it took me to just get this sequence done and understand the spawns a bit better, I must have taken roughly the same amount of time as what it took me to actually beat the Hunter in Chapter 10 without taking any damage and without the Force Gun. And it was just misery, let me tell you. And also, you might have seen right there, Kinesis's detection caused me to grab the body accidentally, and if I didn't grab that body accidentally, I would have been hit by that lurker. Yeah, that's just one of the stupidest moments in this walkthrough so far, where shitty detection on Kinesis just allowed me to survive an attack from one of the most annoying enemy types ever in the entire Dead Space series. And I mean, this sequence, there aren't as many enemies compared to how many there are in the original Dead Space. In fact, just the number of enemies that they throw at you in Dead Space 1 for this chapter, I just feel like the developers gave up on really trying to be intelligent with their enemy placements, and they just spawned so many black necromorphs, lurkers, and exploders. And it just felt so odd for them to appear at the moments that they did. And it didn't feel right, but I do feel like the sequence that I just did is right to a certain extent. It's just the mechanics, for the most part, were against me when I was doing that entire encounter. And that's why I was having to resort to pulse rifle mines to kill a lot of the enemies very quickly, and I was having to kill the lurkers very fast with the flamethrower. And I was also using the plasma cutter to kill lurkers as well, because waiting for them to expose their tentacles takes so long. And one thing that's really bullshit about lurkers on this remake is even when you're shooting them in their tentacles, they can still get shots out on you. Stunning them by shooting them in the tentacles is not possible in this remake because of the way they've changed the stun systems on this game. And even in a game like Dead Space 3, I can't remember a single moment where I've shot a lurker and it's still able to get its shot out on me. And it's one of the most douchey designs ever with this game, and that's why it's just better to use a lot of instant kill options against the lurkers, like with the pulse rifle mines, when you're actually dealing with the normal variant, or just using the necromorph blades. And again, the black lurkers are going to be able to resist the necromorph blade, so it'll take 2, but at least the first necromorph blade is enough to weaken it to the point where 3 plasma cutter shots are enough to kill it. And moving on, we then have this encounter, which is another dumb encounter. I mean, it's just you have to stay near this door because there are so many enemies in the sequence, and there are also exploders. And if you do this just right, you can use the exploder to do critical damage to the brute to the point where you can actually take off a leg using the explosion. And another thing as well is that this door is small enough to the point where the brute is unable to get me if I stand in this hallway. And this brute is busy dilly-dallying or doing whatever the hell he's doing, and he comes to get me, but because I placed the explosion right there, I was immediately able to take off his leg. I definitely recommend severing the explosives off of the exploders and using them to your advantage when you're dealing with the brutes. And since I have stasis, I'm going to be able to freeze this guy and then take off his legs. And there's that last exploder right there. But yeah, that was a really silly encounter. I mean, just the strategy that you saw just then, that was an accidental strategy that I just found on my blind playthrough, and it helped a bit here, but I still feel like it's prone to error, given how awkward it is just trying to implement that strategy. But like I said, this chapter for the most part is pretty dull and repetitive. I just feel like the scenario designs and just the way they use the enemies, I mean, it's all just pretty standard stuff that you've been doing throughout the entirety of Dead Space Remake. I was really hoping for something a lot more fresh. Dead Space 1 suffered from the same issue as well, and I mean, Dead Space 1 was just boring throughout, and, you know, like, I was even rewatching Carcinogen SDA's Dead Space 1 walkthrough, and just seeing the number of rooms that they changed, just so the sequences don't feel so arcadey. Like, I remember there's a sequence in Chapter 10 where you could use kinesis to pull a bunch of doors closed, and you could just sit in the room and just time out the sequence so that Daniels is able to open a door that will allow you to escape the hunter. And why the hell would anyone in their right mind design a room like that on the Ishimura? It's so silly, and there's a lot of dumb arcadey moments like that throughout Dead Space 1, and I do feel like this remake does a pretty good job at removing a lot of the arcadey moments, minus some of the puzzle designs, like with that array puzzle back in Chapter 8. But I don't notice the arcadey designs as much, and I don't know why I didn't say it earlier, but this remake, I definitely feel like this is a better remake than, say, for instance, like Resident Evil 2 Remake. Resident Evil 2 Remake was just a nothing game. It was a very dull game. It didn't have any gameplay. A lot of it was just, oh, just carry a knife with you, or multiple combat knives, and just run past a bunch of dumb enemies. But at least this remake is actually putting a greater incentive on the gameplay and with the enemy types, and it's also making some improvements to the gameplay from Dead Space 1, but also some problems like with the stun systems. But it's also removing a lot of the arcadey designs. It's also improving chapters that weren't that good in the original Dead Space. And that's why I say this remake is largely like a 5.5 out of 10 or a 6 out of 10. And you might be thinking, oh, that's still pretty harsh against the game. But that's only because the chapters after Chapter 6 just aren't as good as the initial chapters. And admittedly, I did like Chapter 8, and I did like a bit of Chapter 7, but I still feel like the halfway point of this game is where the game's quality diminishes in terms of the way they use the enemies, the way they just try to use them in very unintelligent ways. It doesn't feel very smart. It doesn't feel like there was a lot of thought put into how they designed some of the enemy placements and the sequences, and there could have been better, like, imagination to them. And in some cases there is, but I don't feel like the later chapters are as good as the earlier chapters. But that still doesn't mean this game is bad. I still like this game. I think this is my second favorite Dead Space game. My number one favorite is probably Dead Space 2, because Dead Space 2's like chapters, like throughout so much of the game, they're just a lot of fun. And then we get to Chapter 9 and the game's quality diminishes. But, you know, Dead Space 2, I just feel like there's something rejuvenating about it when you're just going through that game initially. But, you know, I'm not saying that Dead Space 2 is perfect. I mean, even though it is my favorite Dead Space game, that still doesn't mean it's on the same level as, like, Resident Evil, for instance. It just means that it's just a better quality Dead Space game. And even Carcinogen SDA agrees that Dead Space 2 is a pretty good game. It grew on him when he was doing his walkthrough. And we had the same sentiments as well about the original version of Dead Space, where the original version of Dead Space just wasn't that good of a game. It was a pretty boring game, and there were a lot of like enemy placements that felt on par with that of Resident Evil Zero stupidities in terms of enemy placements, where they put a lot of high-tiered enemies in single rooms. And I remember there was one room in Chapter 10 where they have like 5 pregnants in one room. Why? What the fuck is the whole point of that? Why do you put that many like special enemy types in a single room? It just doesn't feel very intelligent. It feels very goofy and gamey, and it just seems like it exists for the purpose of existing rather than for a logical explanation. And there are just a lot of like silly moments with the special enemy types, and when they're just gonna appear in like the same frequency as a basic enemy type, they really lose out on their special status. And that's not even mentioning the hitboxes in Dead Space 1. The hitboxes in Dead Space 1 are pretty bad, and Carcinogen SDA has so much evidence of this happening, whether it be the hitboxes on Isaac when he's using his weapons, or when it's like enemy hitboxes, or hitboxes on Stasis, stuff like that. And it all just leads to a pretty draining, fatiguing experience. And moving past mechanics and enemy types, I don't like the environments in Dead Space 1. I don't feel like there's a single environment that stands out as being very interesting or varied. Like, Dead Space 2, on the other hand, Dead Space 2, I feel like, has more memorable areas. There's so much variety to the different areas that you're going to in Dead Space 2 that it helps waylay any potential environmental fatigue you might feel with the game. But Dead Space 2 doesn't handle it very well, and then when you add that to the contrived objectives that Dead Space 1 puts you on, it really becomes repetitive, and you start to see a lot of the numbers and the code that holds the game together, because it's like the developers didn't really have a vision for what they wanted to do with certain sequences, and so they took the easy way out with just making like a fetch quest model, or just, oh, go do this and just get out of the area, stuff like that. It all feels pretty contrived, like very artificial in the implementation, and Dead Space 1 doesn't hide this very well. And while I have said a lot about Dead Space 1, I still feel like I haven't explained everything that I don't like about Dead Space 1, and I would honestly put Dead Space 1 and 3 on like the same level as just taking last place, and then this game takes second place, and then Dead Space 2 is first place. That's my ranking of the series based on what I played with those games, and yeah, that's all I have to say about that. But enough negativity. We have this amazing final boss fight. This boss fight is absolutely perfect. I mean, it might seem dragged out to you guys, it might seem simple, but it all works within the confines of the designs put in place with this game. And I don't feel like it's a dragged out fight whatsoever. In fact, I feel like this fight does a great job at hiding the fact that it's roughly an 8-minute encounter, even with the upgrades that I have. But it's all because there's a lot of variety to what's happening, and like there's a lot of differentiation with what the boss does, and then you have the enemy types coming in just to spice things up, and then you have the boss doing his acid attacks to cut you off, and then you gotta angle yourself correctly to avoid the tentacles that he uses against you. You know, I just feel like there is a level of skill and good designs put in place with this fight that just allows it to be longer than like 5 minutes and still be a lot of fun and not be dragged out. And I gotta give credit to the developers for making this boss fight good, because I thought this boss fight would be just as bad as the Leviathan or the Hunter, but it's not. This is the single greatest boss fight in Dead Space Remake by far. And honestly, like, throughout the entire Dead Space series, there haven't been that many good bosses, and even the original hive mind from the original Dead Space wasn't that interesting, but they've managed to make the hive mind boss fight a lot better for this remake. And just to talk about the first phase of the fight, you have to destroy the weak spots on his head, and every time you destroy a weak spot, he will fire these balls at you, which he just did. And if you are near the balls, when they explode, you will take damage. So position yourself far away from them, or you can shoot the balls in case you are caught in a bad spot. And every time he fires the balls, he will then follow up with a tentacle attack, and he will always indicate this with a rather satisfying vroom sound effect. I don't know what it is, but every time the boss makes that vroom sound effect when he's about to hit you with a tentacle, it just sounds very satisfying. It's like asthma-inducing on my end, so it's great to hear that kind of sound effect for this kind of boss. But anyway, when you hear that sound effect, it means he's going to use his tentacle against you, and so you've got to run to the sides in order to avoid it, or you can do like a U pattern where you just move in a U shape to just avoid the move. This is especially handy in the last phase of the fight, and you'll be able to avoid the tentacles. But now that I've destroyed all the weak spots, these enemies are going to show up, and I'm going to use a combination of the flamethrower and the pulse rifle mines in order to dispatch the enemies. There will be a couple of enhanced necromorphs, some normal necromorphs, and also some exploders. I don't remember if there are any other enemy types. Does a pregnant spawn here as well? I can't remember. But there's an exploder. It's still not over yet. There are still more coming. They're going to come out of the hatches, and they're also going to climb up that railing over there. But the flamethrower is just really good for this fight. It's just really good at stunning the enhanced necromorphs and also the regular necromorphs. There aren't any armored necromorphs that are just going to run through the fire like bullshit. There aren't any lurkers shooting at you. Like, the game uses the right enemy types for this boss fight to make it very fun and not frustrating. And you can trust the mechanics a lot more because of the specific enemy types that they use during this boss fight. And you'll see right here, I'm again using the flamethrower. Anytime they die, I'm going to rip off their blades and use them against the other necromorphs. And then this right here was very hairy. It's stuff like that that makes me appreciate the enemy types that they used here. Because imagine if that was an armored necromorph. Imagine if this was some other necromorph type that didn't respond to the flamethrower or my other weapons. They could use bullshit attacks like that to get a cheap hit on me. And it's just garbage that way. And the fact that they took the time to think about the enemy types that they were going to use in this fight just goes to show that they actually cared about what they were delivering when they were making this final boss fight, and it's great to see that. But once those enemies are dead, you will not be encountering any more enemies for this boss fight, and this is the final phase of the fight. So what's going to happen is he's going to occasionally expose his chest weak spots whenever he's done like 4 of these tentacle slams after he uses the acid attack. Whenever he fires the acid at you initially, he will place it where you are, and the acid will last until you actually destroy a weak spot. And because I position myself correctly when I'm at the side of the arena, I have more room to avoid his volley of tentacle slams. And it's skillful stuff like that that also makes this fight really good. Like the fact that they're giving you the chance to control where he places that acid so that you have more room to avoid his tentacle slams is very intelligent. And it's player agency that's interesting in this game. And that right there was cutting it very close, and my movement could have been a lot better. But at least the tentacles don't have phantom range. Like, how many games have you played where tentacle slams like these tend to have phantom range for no reason? I mean, that is a pretty honest hitbox right there. And how could they fine-tune the hitboxes that well for this boss fight, yet not for the other enemies? I can't even begin to tell you the amount of times I have been fucked by phantom range on an enemy's, like, blade attack. Like, do you know the amount of times a normal necromorph has done, like, that slam move that they do, where they just stab their blades into the ground to try to hit you? I've been hit by phantom range on that move so many times, and you've seen it in a couple of my bloopers for this walkthrough. But it happens way more frequently than what I actually showed in my blooper section for the videos. But I need to talk about this phase right here. So I've destroyed enough weak spots to the point where the boss will now use the acid attack multiple times. And then on the third use of the acid, that's when it will be permanent until he reveals his weak spot. So positioning yourself correctly to ensure that you have enough room to avoid the tentacles is made a bit harder thanks to the fact that you're having to move around a lot more frequently, and he's kind of controlling where you're going. But he's done 2 acid attacks, and so the third acid attack will be permanent until he reveals his weak spot. And he's placed the acid in a good spot, so I have plenty of room to avoid the volley of tentacle attacks. Even if you don't have a lot of room, as long as you understand your angles, you'll be fine. But I only have to destroy 1 more weak spot before the boss cues the cinematic phase, where he hangs you upside down and you have to shoot the weak spot before he kills you. On the original Dead Space, this section was awful because the original Dead Space's laser-sighted system was not designed very well. Like right now, you can actually see where you're pointing, but on the original Dead Space, it is so hard to see where you're pointing because a laser-sighted system is not built for this kind of camera angle system. But the fact that they've at least made the end of the laser easier to see is perfect. So I can actually use the pulse rifle to my advantage to actually shoot this guy's weak spot, and I believe you have unlimited ammo during the sequence. And once the weak spot is destroyed, that will be the end of this game. And with this boss's death, this concludes my Dead Space remake. Hard difficulty, no damage walkthrough. I don't really have any plans to do impossible difficulty because, again, impossible difficulty is just hard difficulty but with no saves. So, like, all the strategies that I showcased in this walkthrough will pretty much work on impossible difficulty. Of course, the only thing you'll have to correct is getting the Force Gun from Chapter 6. Getting the Force Gun from Chapter 6 is definitely recommended to make the later chapters a lot more bearable compared to the shit I had to go through trying to record them for this walkthrough. But stay tuned for my future walkthroughs. Thank you all for watching, and you take care now.